Hello and welcome back to Heirloom Garden, and for this week's episode I thought we'd discuss not only what to sow when, but how to figure out for your particular growing zone what to sow according to your temperature, climate, and soil temperature needs. So I think this is the big mistake that a lot of people make when planning their crop sowing and their transplanting dates, is to only consider the first frost-free date, when really we need to be thinking about soil temperatures for a lot of those crops like the nightshades and the squash and the cucumbers and melons that really are more dependent on soil temperatures. So that really applies here in the Pacific Northwest because we have really long, cool springs. So we never really get a hard frost, especially in the early spring. We're pretty much out of the frost danger zone, but it's still not warm enough to plant out our tomatoes, peppers, all of our solanaceous vegetables, and our squashes. It's still simply too cool because the temperatures are generally in the 60s and 70s, but the soil temperature, which is really what determines how well our solanaceous crops are going to do, the soil temperatures still haven't reached those 70 plus temperatures until May, really sometimes well into May. And that's really another thing we need to consider, is what type of spring are we having? Because here, especially on the West Coast, we're really at the mercy of the La Nina and El Nino weather patterns. So for instance, in a La Nina year, we could have a really cool wet spring all the way up until June. Whereas in El Nino years, we can have, like we had last year, we could have a really hot spring heat wave in May. And our springs can actually heat up quite quickly then. So I think we really need to put a little bit more effort into planning exactly when we need to sow our crops. And I think it's a better way to think about this issue than simply to go month by month and tell you what you should be planting when, although I love those videos because they do inspire us to get back in the garden and help us get thinking about these issues. I think there's a better way to approach this climate for your temperature, for your climate, and for your soil temperature needs. So as I said, we are in the Portland metro area, zone 8B. We have long, cool, wet springs. And so we really want to use the frost-free dates to determine when we're going to plant out our leafy greens and brassicas. So for leafy greens and brassicas, particularly non-heading leafy greens and brassicas like kale, Asian mustard greens, lettuces, spinach, all of those can be sown quite early in our climates because we really don't get any hard frost. We really have light frost, and also many varieties can be well adapted to light frost conditions. And if you want to hear more about that, please go watch my seed varieties video. But for heading varieties of brassicas like cauliflowers and broccolis, we want to wait until we are about 2 weeks before our frost-free date in order to plant out. And then from there, we want to back calculate when we're going to sow our seeds. So we have to be a little bit more conscientious of the frost-free date when we're planting our heading brassicas. But for our non-heading brassicas and leafy greens, we're really good to go to sow from February all the way onward, and really even as early as late January. We could start sowing them, growing them indoors, and getting them ready for our long, cool, wet springs here. Now, on the flip side of that, to plan out when we're going to sow our nightshades and plan out when we're going to sow our squashes, we really want to consider when the soil temperatures are really going to hit their 70 plus temperature ranges. So for us, sometimes that can happen as early as mid to late April, and then more often it's going to happen as early as early May, and sometimes that can even go into mid-May and later, depending on, as I said, the yearly weather cycles. So we want to back calculate our nightshade sowing using that early May, maybe late April, mid-April day. And we want to also break this down by how slow growing and fast growing our crops are. So things like eggplants and peppers can be grown in containers for a long time because they are very slow growing, and especially in the ahi pepper and the hot pepper family, those are really slow growing crops. So they can really take much longer to get going, and we can have them in our houses, in our greenhouses for much longer, and that can actually really benefit them and get them off to a strong start when we are ready to plant them out. On the other hand, things like squashes grow extremely quickly. They outgrow their containers, they get root bound, they get nutrient deficiencies if we sow them too early. So we really want to hold off on sowing those. So with that all in mind, let's go through category by category when I'm going to sow every single crop using Zone 8B, the Portland metro area, as an example, but noting how you can apply this method to calculate for your own growing zone and your own conditions what to sow when. So for leafy greens and brassicas, as I said, we want to estimate this relative to our frost-free date. And so the first order of business becomes estimating that frost-free date. So for me, I've estimated it generously as April 1st, because as I said, we don't have much risk with these leafy greens that they're not going to grow, because we're pretty much just eating them for their vegetative growth anyway. We're not relying on them to produce a flower head like what a cauliflower is, which is actually a flower. We just want them to produce greens. So we can estimate that as April 1st here. You can look on a few different sources for that information. Garden.org has probabilities broken down for each area, when there's a 90% probability of 32 degrees versus a 50% probability of 32 degrees. Again, for this estimate, I was just being generous. There's also Old Farmer's Almanac, which gives a more straightforward estimate, and it estimates that as April 5th in our area. So while it's hard to be precise, it doesn't really need to be precise, because anyways, we can just continue to watch our weather cycles and plant out relative to that and hold our crops indoors for longer if we really need to. I think the greater danger here is actually starting our crops too late, because there can be those really blistering early spring heat waves sometimes. And so we really want to get our brassicas out early rather than later, because that can make our vegetables go bitter and taste bad, and it can cause them to bolt. So for cauliflower and broccoli, if we are starting them off too early, we can just keep them in longer, and they don't tend to grow too quickly, so that'll be just fine. And leafy greens, again, even if there's a light frost, we can just plant them out. So for lettuces, spinach, kale, cabbage, which is again another non-flowering brassica, and for Asian greens, they can be started extremely early in our mild Pacific Northwest winters. They can be started as early as January, especially winter adapted varieties. And make sure you check out my seed variety video again for more information about that. So your best tip is the best tip actually is to let your lettuce flower and self-seed. And I really saw the miracle of this. Just a couple days ago, I visited my lettuce bed from last year, and I saw 45 little starts of lettuce had already popped up there with no work on my part. I just redistributed them around, and because they are the self-seeding varieties, they actually are already adapted and hardened off and adapted to the cold environment. So if I continue to save seeds from that, I might be able to get even more locally adapted strains. So I think that's really cool too. But for most of us, especially if we're starting off our garden, we are going to do indoor sowing. So the ideal starting date for lettuce, spinach, kale, cabbage, and Asian greens is from January 22nd to February 5th. We can plant all these types of vegetables out 4 weeks before the last frost. So that back calculated from April 1st is March 4th. And then if we back calculate further, we know that we have to grow them indoors for about 4 to 6 weeks to develop strong seedlings. So that's how we get to our January 22nd to February 5th sowing date. Now for cauliflower and broccoli, temperatures must be a little higher, as I said, for the plant to begin flowering in order to produce the part that we eat. So I calculated the ideal starting date of broccoli and cauliflower as February 5th to February 19th. So we can plant our broccoli and cauliflower out 2 weeks before the last frost. That's March 18th, using that April 1st date. and they must be grown indoors for about 4 to 6 weeks to develop healthy seedlings. So again, don't worry if you're a little late right now, just get them planted out ASAP. There's a little bit of flexibility, nothing has to be too precise, but that means that in early February, especially in our mild Pacific Northwest climates, where we can have really hot springs, we really do have to get a lot of this sowing done in early February in terms of all of our brassicas and leafy greens, and that's exactly what I'll show you today. I'll give you some tips about how to sow these, how I get these seeds started. Now moving on to our next important category, we're talking about nightshades. So for nightshades, soil temperatures have to be above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And actually for tomatoes, it's ideally 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Eggplants, ideally 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And for peppers, it's ideally 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So here in the Pacific Northwest, as I noted, it really might take until early May to get the soil temperatures there. And I've generously estimated my plant out date as April 15th. Again, because these are slow growing plants and they don't mind hanging out indoors, whereas we might think that we should really back calculate from that May date, I'm budgeting in a little bit extra time here because I know these are slow growing, they don't mind hanging out inside, and I also have a perfect greenhouse built for them to hang out and harden off and really get adapted. And in particular, again, those hot peppers and eggplants, really slow to start growing, so I don't mind being a little bit extra generous, giving them a little bit extra time. So all of these plants need about 8 weeks to form healthy seedlings. So that means back calculated, we need to start them around February 19th for our nightshades. So again, a lot of seed sowing needs to be done in February. And we can really start our eggplants and our hot ahi peppers even earlier than that if we really want to get a head start on the season, because of course those are really long season crops and eggplants are really slow growing. So my best advice here is to really keep an eye on the forecast because of course there's the El Nino, La Nina patterns. And the most important thing is that we really want to look for nights that are consistently no cooler than 50 degrees. Because even though they will survive in those temperatures, they may be stunted, they may not do well. And so many people make the mistake of planting out their tomatoes too early. They get hit with the frost and it just wasn't worth it. They'll grow much more healthy and strong in a greenhouse or inside. And remember, you do have to harden off these plants too. Now for squash, cucumbers, and melons, soil temperatures have to be even higher. They have to be 75, and 75 to 85 is really ideal. Again, these are really fast growing seedlings that quickly outgrow their cell trays and they need to be potted up or they get root bound and nutrient deficient. So in this case, I conservatively estimated my plant out date as May 5th. So that I don't have old root-bound seedlings hanging around my house and taking over my really limited space that I have indoors to grow. And we really only need 3 weeks to form healthy seedlings for all of these. So we want to start them April 14th. So we have a lot of seed sowing to do in February for our vegetables, but then we really want to hold off for our squash, melons, and cucumbers until mid-April. So quite a range and distinction between when we sow our various crops. Now I'll also briefly summarize the flowers that I'm growing in here and how we want to decide when to seed start for them. So for indoor sown flowers, their plant out date is simply when we are frost free. So because we're simply growing them for flowers, there's not much more complicated than that. We want to plant them out when we are frost free, which I would give a range of April 1st to April 15th for that. Now for dianthus, delphinium, foxglove, yarrow, hollyhock, echinacea, those are all slow growing and they need 10 weeks to grow inside before they're ready to be planted out. So I would plant all of those, seed start all of those around February 5th. And actually delphinium generally needs even longer if you want it to flower in that first year. So that one, delphinium, has to be started around January 22nd. In order to get it to flower in its first year for you, but otherwise simply be patient. It will flower for you the next year and it will establish itself, perennialize, biennialize, or whatever. Our next group are lupine, salvia, Icelandic poppy, sweet peas, and China asters. And those all need to be started 6 to 8 weeks before being planted out on that frost-free date. So for those, I've estimated a seed sowing day of about February 19th. Now the next category is, of course, our outdoor sown flowers, and their seed sowing dates are determined by when the soil temperatures are best for their germination. So nasturtium, alyssum, forget-me-nots, they should all be sown 2 weeks before the last frost date. So that's about sometime after March 18th, because they really can handle and germinate in those cooler soils. But things like zinnias, cosmos, marigold, those should all be sown 1 week after the frost-free date. So I've estimated that as April 8th, or it could be even a little bit later in April. And I've sown it actually well into May because they really do well in those warmer soils. And we have quite a bit more flexibility when it comes to flowers because we're not really expecting to eat our harvest, and they're generally not as time dependent as the other ones. Now, a brief note about herbs. Most herbs can be direct sown from March through May, and they really do have a lot more flexibility because we just eat the leaves. So anytime March till May, when the soil temperatures are warm enough, and you should succession sow them as well, highly recommend that for cilantro. So with all of that said, I've also made a handy weekender calendar for myself that puts together all of my flower and seed varieties, and when I should seed start them and when I should plant them out, so that I can organize my time and use it efficiently. I hope you guys have found this video informative and are going to use it to help plan your seed starting schedule and your planting out schedule. And I hope it's a little bit more informative than those guides that just tell you what to sow in this month and you don't really know why or the logic behind it. So here's some quick seed starting tips to help you get your garden ready. You can either use a pre-made starting mix or you can make your own, which is a lot more inexpensive. There's a lot of options. I've seen some people that just use compost and other people that just use coco coir, but I prefer an enriched media that helps get the plants off to a good start so there's not as much of a rush to transplant them into larger cells. You can use about 2 parts compost, 2 parts coco coir, and 2 parts perlite, or 1 part perlite and 1 part vermiculite. I only had perlite on hand. Ideally, your compost is sifted, but you can also just pick out the larger sticks by hand. Make sure you add in a good handful of bone meal, worm castings, and also recommend some mycorrhizal inoculant. I just had those lying around, so I did. And always start with a pre-moistened media. I also recommend trays that allow bottom watering so the top can dry off and the moisture can simply be wicked up. This really helps promote good and deep root growth and also prevents dampening off. Make sure you read the instructions on your seed packet. So here I'm sowing some yarrow, and yarrow really needs light to germinate. So I'm simply sprinkling the seeds on top of the media. I'm only going to water it with a mist so that I don't displace the seed, and then I'm going to lightly press the seeds into the soil so that they make contact. I also recommend you use trays that have a humidity dome so that you can help create an ideal environment for our seeds to germinate. And of course, don't forget to add a label. For peas and other large seeds with tough coats, I recommend you germinate them in moistened paper towels and then plant them in deeper single cells because we want their taproots to form properly and they can bolt to the bottom of our cell trays really easily. So we need to put them in larger pots or larger single cell trays. Moisten a paper towel and then wring it out. Fold the seeds into the paper towel and then place the moistened paper towel with the seeds in a plastic baggie. Make sure you label the baggies and check daily for germination, and when they germinate, do immediately plant them in small 3-inch pots or deep cells because they can get intertwined into the paper towel. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked it, leave a comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.